one of my experiences, which most people have never had, is I was witness, because of my position at Google and because of, at the time, and because of my history of being a very prominent businessman in the Middle East for a long time. So I was very much entangled into what was happening with the Arab Spring. Not that I had any views on it, because I had not lived in my home country, Egypt, for maybe 20 years at the time. But, I'd been in a position of, I know the internet really well, so almost everyone was constantly reaching out to me, the previous government, the transition government, the opposition. Everyone was just talking to me all the time, saying what's happening, right? And I have to admit, in my mind, I think the Arab Spring seems to have been a glitch in the system, where somehow, because Arabs at the time were so offline, if you want, you gave them a tiny bit of online community, and suddenly they go like, this is shit, right? And they organize and they explode, okay? And I have to say, I feel that leading after the Arab Spring into 2019, 2020, you could see quite a bit of organized opposition around the world, Hong Kong, here in the UK, and so on and so forth. And I don't think that this is the reason for COVID. I'm not into that conspiracy at all, okay? And I know you wrote about, the COVID economy, if you want. But it seems to me that somehow governments found a massive opportunity to say, okay, everyone stay home, right? Let's not organize in the streets anymore, no more Arab Spring. And you could actually recognize very quickly that post-COVID, everyone's silent. Everyone's like, yeah, what was that? Right? And let's talk about that era a little bit. No conspiracy theory here. But two things happened with COVID. One is actually society at large was disciplined.
Yes.
Everyone was ordered to sit home. Nobody had freedom to do anything. But at the same time, massive amounts of money were funneled into the system through printing money, basically more debt, right? And I think that completely shifted. I think this was the one big nail in the coffin of freedom, if you think about it. What do you think of that?
I think, that is a very interesting and well thought through analysis, because you're right, it's not conspiratorial to say that governments in particular, but also big multinational corporations, took advantage of a crisis to strengthen their position. And you see this happening over and over and over again. Naomi Klein talks about the shock doctrine and disaster capitalism, the way in which the powerful are able to take advantage of moments of crisis and uncertainty to embed and strengthen their control. One example that she uses, which I find really fascinating, is the example of the tsunami and the crisis and devastation that took place in the Maldives, and the way in which that was used to remove people who had been living on the islands in the Maldives for a very, very long time, settle them all in a very, very small area of the capital, and ultimately sell those islands off to big hotels so that they would become centers for, luxury tourism, basically. Yeah. Now, no one's saying the government caused that natural disaster, but they took advantage of it to basically kind of redistribute power and wealth within that economy. And I think that you can say the same about the pandemic. And that takes place both within individual societies and at the level of the world economy. Now, you mentioned there, having been born in the Middle East and been a businessman in the Middle East for a while, and that idea of debt as a disciplining tool resonates with you. Now, you can see that at the level of kind of individual consumers, but you can also see that at the level of whole states.
Nations at large, exactly. Of course.
So the name for my book, Vulture Capitalism, comes from this vulture fund, basically, which was just after the 2008 financial crisis. Zambia, which is a relatively small African nation, big copper producer, had nothing to do with the financial crisis, but because of the collapse in world GDP after 2008, copper prices fell, its export revenues kind of dried up, and its debts started to look unsustainable. So there was an Irish fund that bought Zambia's debt, knowing that Zambia was going to default on that debt, so that it could sue the government of Zambia for failing to pay its debts and take vast amounts of money out of the pockets of ordinary Zambians and suck it back into the rich world. Now, this is the kind of what you might call kind of lawfare. It's like warfare using international legal systems that you see all the time in the world economy. And debt is a very powerful tool for basically crushing entire nations, and particularly nations where you're beginning to see some resistance to the dynamics of global capitalism. And I think you're quite right that we did start to see that in a really big way before the pandemic. I think part of the reason for that was that we were moving from a unipolar world into a multipolar world. Now, you know, you can say whatever you want about the dynamics that underpin that, but ultimately, when you have two superpowers, all the other countries in the world economy have a little bit more leverage, a little bit more room, basically, because they're able to choose.
Play them.
Exactly. Pit them off against each other. Before, it was the Washington consensus, which is, you know, you follow the rules laid out by Washington, or you don't get any money and you're kind of ostracized from the world economy. Now these countries have more than one superpower to pick from. They can maybe go to China if they want lending for infrastructure. That's going to come with a lot of strings attached and a lot of problems, but ultimately there is this choice. Now, what you see over the course of the pandemic is a lot of nations being really kind of beaten down using the tool of debt, because a lot of countries, as soon as the pandemic hit, basically found themselves unable to repay their debts through no fault of their own. The global economy had been shut down. You know, the factories that were using the resources that they were exporting were no longer operating. Suddenly they were unable to pay their debts. We had a debt moratorium, so a pause on debt repayments, but the debts themselves
kept increasing because of interest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that has continued to this day, except for the fact that it's getting worse because of climate breakdown. So you see, you know, natural disasters, cyclones, hurricanes. We've just seen in the Caribbean recently that caused massive devastation. And Caribbean nations come forward and say, you know, we as the international community have agreed that small island countries at risk of desertification, all of these problems that are going to come from climate breakdown, we shouldn't be the only ones that have to bear the burden of climate breakdown. So we would like some of these debts that we're going to have to take out to reconstruct after this natural disaster that we didn't cause, that basically you in the global north caused. We're going to ask for some grace on that debt. And what they get is so tiny, it's barely enough to allow them to recover, let alone put in place the conditions for sustainable long-term economic growth.